Welcome to Global Conversations, Round 3, The View from 30,000 Feet. We are so excited to have Professor Zannie Voss of SMU DataArts. Welcome, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us. So tell us a little bit about your background, how you came into academics. Data in the arts is a relatively new concept. Weave in how you've helped create this field.
I kind of came into academia through a back door. And by that, I mean that my background was in management of nonprofit professional theaters. My training is I have an MBA and was at the Alley Theater as associate director, then moved into managing director of PlayMakers Repertory Company, which is on the campus of UNC Chapel Hill. And that managing director position came with a faculty position. And so I had to figure out what did that mean to be a faculty member. And as much as I enjoyed the teaching, I realized that there would also be, as part of the tenure process, an emphasis on what kind of research record had I established. And at the time, there was transition in leadership at Theater Communications Group, which is a national service organization for nonprofit theaters. And so I asked if I would be able to use the data from their historical annual report called Theater Facts as part of research. And the first year they allowed us to do some data collection with managing directors and match that with the fiscal and operating information from the fiscal survey. That evolved into us starting to analyze the data of the fiscal survey and publish annual reports. So we've been working with Theater Communications Group now since 1998, publishing that annual report. And I realized how much I enjoyed research, and that in running an arts organization, there were so many times that I wished that there were a resource that I could turn to in making decisions, about the strategy of the organization with respect to marketing, fundraising, finances, understanding how we were doing relative to others. So that was really the start of wanting to understand what are the strategic factors that influence performance for nonprofit arts and cultural organizations. From there, I got a PhD in management and have used it in the service of arts and culture since.
Tell us about the integration of Cultural Data Project, which became DataArts, National Center of Arts Research, and then your move to SMU.
Sure. So we had been two legacy organizations. The Cultural Data Profile was started by Pew Charitable Trusts. It was spun off from Pew into its own 501c3 and changed its name to DataArts. I was on the board of DataArts, and in the meantime, we had started the National Center for Arts Research at SMU in 2013. And what we were doing with NCAR, National Center for Arts Research, was integrating existing data sets on arts and culture to try and model the national arts and culture ecosystem. And one of our primary sources of organization level data was DataArts Cultural Data Profile. On the other hand, DataArts was heavily focused on data collection and doing some research on a kind of fee-for-service basis, but not asking its own questions out of its own data set. The merger of NCAR and DataArts came about somewhat because Beth Tuttle, who was then the CEO of DataArts, announced that she was leaving, and the board just wanted to explore a potential merger as another strategic option rather than simply just going out and rehiring another CEO. What made so much sense is that we have complementary missions. We have complementary strengths and capabilities. And as a merged organization, we simply kind of sat back, did all of the analysis over the course of a year, and decided that we could have more impact on the field as one organization rather than two separate organizations. So we merged in 2018, and now as a merged organization, we're kind of soup to nuts, doing everything from data collection to initial level insights to more in-depth and sophisticated methodologies and both academic research as well as practitioner research. And we provide tools for the field.
Wow. So how many people are on faculty? Are there computers in some dusty sub-basement 5 that are constantly running data? Tell us a little bit about the mechanics of how this works.
Well, we are a staff of 32. There are about 2/3 of the staff that are based still in Philadelphia, which is where DataArts had been located. I'm a full-time faculty member, and Glenn Voss, who's the research director, is an emeritus faculty from Cox now and the faculty in Meadows. We have a number of academic fellows, faculty both from Cox School of Business in areas such as information technology and operations management. We've had fellows who are econometricians, marketing faculty. We have a fellow who is in organizational behavior at London Business School, Dan Cable. We work with a number of different researchers who are really high caliber. They bring a lot to the table. Their interest is in publishing academic research, and we go to them and say, hey, we have this really great data set. Instead of asking the same kinds of questions in another industry, can we ask them and work with them so that whatever is learned, we can translate and disseminate for the field of arts and cultural leaders? But we have SMU as kind of the umbrella organization, and it's great because SMU has been incredibly supportive of the merger and SMU DataArts work.
So just to sort of give an overview of the process, I'm a small arts organization, theater, puppet, small symphony, and SMU DataArts comes calling. I pick up the phone or I answer the email because?
Typically, it's not that we're necessarily going to the organizations and asking them to submit their data. When they apply to a grant maker, or if they're a member of one of the national service organizations that uses the CDP as a data collection platform for their membership, that's when they submit their data as part of that application or participation process. That data then comes to us. What we try to do, we see arts and cultural leaders, those who are running arts and cultural organizations, as our primary target. We are here to serve them, to help to provide high quality data and evidence-based insights and resources that are going to help them to overcome challenges and increase impact. So when they hear from us, it's because they've entered data. We reach out to them and say, hey, look, here is what can be learned from the data that you entered. How can we help them to translate that data into knowledge, both general knowledge about the field, about their sector, as well as how do we kind of mass customize tools that helps them to see how their organization fits into the larger ecology.
There are lots of challenges, so I'm gonna move to a couple of surveys that you completed. The first one is the Alchemy of High Performing Arts Organizations, and then the second one, which is Arts and Cultural Organizations in it for the long haul. Oh boy. Can you talk a little bit about, let's start actually with the long haul because it's the most immediate for us now. I believe your study says the estimated aggregate $6.8 billion net effect of COVID-19 crisis on the not-for-profit arts and culture sector equates to a deficit of 26% of the average organization. Holy moly.
Yeah. We started that project in part actually as we had gotten underway with the Alchemy of High Performing Arts Organizations project back in January, and finished the interviews for that mid-March, which is just as COVID was starting to heat up. And we had a webinar. This research was done in partnership with the Wallace Foundation, with the heads of different nonprofit arts service organizations. And there was a sense in that webinar that the service organizations were hearing from their member organizations that they couldn't even start to think beyond the immediate crisis. So we said, how can we help organizations to start moving beyond the immediate and start thinking, okay, what's going to be life for the next year? Let's just think 1 year out. So with the Mellon Foundation's help, we worked with numerous national service organizations who were already in the midst of conducting member surveys about the impact of COVID, collected all of that data, and did estimates based on those responses to the larger data set, which is not only cultural data, profile data, but also all of the IRS 990 data. So a much larger picture of the arts and culture field. Pulling in estimates not only of revenue loss, estimated revenue loss, but also looking at expense savings. So we thought that was important to take into account by not providing programming. How could we make sure we were factoring that in? Looking at job loss, and the 26% was really only estimating that organizations would be able to start reopening in October. Honestly, now I think that the impact will actually be greater than what we had published in the long haul report back in March. That seemed to be a reasonable estimate in what people were considering. That's a moment to stop and say, okay, if this is true for our organization, and this year this is going to mean a 26% deficit, how are we going to deal with that? How are we going to see a path forward? So the long haul report, we worked with my good friend and colleague and partner, Jill Robinson at TRG Arts. We said, let's start by acknowledging these pandemics and how can we have this conversation about the future? And so the framework we used was really based on kind of a blue ocean strategy. It's really looking at what is the organization's value proposition? What kind of value does it provide? What kind of benefits does it provide that exceeds the costs of engaging with it for some set of stakeholders? What is the people proposition? So does the organization have sufficient capacity? How does its human resources and the way it interacts with communities align with that value proposition? And then what's the revenue proposition? So what is the economic engine that is going to be able to support the value proposition and the organizational capacity to meet it? In each of those different propositions, they have to be aligned, that you can't be out of whack and have this great value proposition and no revenue engine that supports it. You also can't have a super large value proposition and be killing your staff because you don't have enough organizational capacity really to carry it out. So starting to think about different questions related to each of those value propositions is a way to guide and reflect on how organizations were going to be able to continue.
My assumption is, and it's, I would imagine for theater folks, for art folks, these three sort of categories or baskets are a very different way of thinking about what's going on a day-to-day basis in their organization than they're used to. So it's really pulling your thinking. And as you said, if you're in the day-to-day of it, it must be difficult, but necessary to pull your head up and out. As you were talking, I was thinking of, New York City versus Tallahassee, two ballet companies with really different circumstances, or Los Angeles or Oregon, or, smaller towns in Texas, how each of them needs to respond to their own community and find their own path forward. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because you're talking big data sets and a set of principles that are overarching. And yet so many of these groups are so individual and so, focused in their community, or should be, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm. And this kind of dovetails into the Alchemy research and kind of what we think of as the cornerstones for success. What's become compellingly clear to me during the process between long haul and Alchemy is the critical importance of being community oriented. And by that, I don't simply mean saying, oh yeah, we provide programs for the community. It's a listening orientation. It means getting out into the community and asking, how can we meet your needs? In light of COVID, that might change. Business as usual, the way you've always done things might have to be altered because the community's needs have altered. So if your doors are closed, does it simply mean that you have a "we're closed, give us money" sign on your website and that's it? Are you really rethinking deeply about, as an organization, what do we have? What do we do? What do we know? And how can we leverage those assets for the benefit of the community at this point in time? How can we serve? And what that means is going to vary community by community. Some of the leaders that we had spoken with said, if you're super successful in understanding and listening to your community, and then you move to a different community, you can't assume that what you learned in one community is necessarily going to apply to another. It's a lot harder work, but that relevancy and that being meaningful has never been more important than it is now. And in part, it's because of the fact that when you reopen your doors, somebody has to care that you do that. What are you doing now? Your sense of how you're serving your community, your people, is going to be what you're remembered by when this crisis is over with.
So can you give us, I have one in mind, but can you give us some examples of, for example, dance companies that have done that well?
Well, I can tell you, Dallas Black Dance Theater
Okay.
in Dallas, Texas. You talk with Zannie Giraud, who is the executive director, and she is exuberant with a sense of opportunity. You know, that they, instead of having a kind of reactive stance, are being proactive at this time to seize opportunities. And I've heard from many organizations that have more of an optimistic outlook, that they've seen this as an opportunity for change. You know, that historically they wanted to explore digital programming and really never had a compelling reason why they should. COVID has presented a compelling reason. Now they're gaining expertise. They're understanding how to become expert in the medium. You know, even when doors open again and they have in-person programming, as someone expressed yesterday in an interview that I did, it's a question of giving someone a taste of something and they like it, and then they're going to have an appetite for it. So, you know, how do you continue kind of on both tracks moving forward? The world will change. You know, the sense of next normal is an opportunity for organizations that are willing to adapt.
Yeah. And I really do see this as an opportunity for a democratization of possibility. So that the biggest company in the world, in some ways now, because it's virtual programming, can be on the level of one of the smallest, right? There's definitely a cacophony of voices asking to be heard, and sorting through that, I think, is itself a political process. And so we're talking to a number of arts journalists and the dean of the Meadows School of Journalism, because who gets heard, of course, right? Who breaks through is itself in some ways a very political proposition. But I do think the possibility is out there for people to experience dance on a completely different level than they have before, or any other art form. It's just, you know, making the time to get it all done. Here's a big, huge picture question. What do you want to accomplish as a researcher and a leader in academic component of dance and the arts?
As a researcher, my ultimate goal is to be useful. You know, that there's a lot of academic research that has really sophisticated methodology and reveals some very interesting findings, but it's a question of how do you take those findings and say them in a way that is going to resonate with someone who is in the driver's seat running an organization. That the ability to apply sophisticated methodology, and sometimes asking the hard questions, simply requires a more sophisticated methodology. We're fortunate that we have researchers who are skilled in that way, but then how do we make it actionable so that somebody, my goal as a researcher is somebody running an arts and cultural organization will have learned something from this work that helps them to make better decisions in their own organization. And that as a result, they're able to become more financially stable and reach a greater footprint in their community.
I'm a little bit older. I think in the 60s and the 70s, there was more money washing around in some ways, and people felt a little freer to make mistakes simply because production costs have gone up so much now. You know, Chicago has an extraordinarily vibrant theater scene. Many of those, I mean, Chicago Shakespeare Theater, I'm on the board, one of my favorites, started in a pub, right? In the second floor of a pub. And I think those organizations are still being created every day, but sustaining them is definitely becoming, I think, more challenging. And especially going from a legacy founder to what comes next. Aside from your own research, what other findings, studies that you at SMU or your colleagues or what's out there, what's interesting you these days?
COVID, of course, is top of mind, and some of the more interesting studies that I've heard of and have been referencing recently. One is from the Knight Foundation. It was leveraging momentum, a study of strategy shifts in 8 major arts institutions. There is Plaka Cohen and Slover Lynette's special COVID edition of Culture Track, which is about community in a time of crisis. There's some really interesting findings that have emerged in that study, and I know they're going to be following up with additional insights in subsequent reports. In terms of museums, AAM had put out a national survey of the museum field's response to COVID, and some kind of sobering statistics in there about the estimated number of museums who don't expect to make it through this time of crisis. I'm also kind of inspired at the same time of, there's a book that I had come across recently called The Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson. The sense of how do you create a workplace? How do you take care of your people in good times and in bad, that are going to inspire, because in the end, particularly with performing arts organizations, our mission is live through our people and how they connect to not only their art, but to communities. So research-based books like that, I find a lot of inspiration in terms of helping to shift thinking away simply from looking at what's going on in the short term to saying, how do you move forward? How do you get to a place where you have taken care of your people and created an environment where there is a sense of being able to take risks, voices can be heard, there's a participatory management style. As I said, my PhD is in management, so that kind of research really excites me.
Yeah, so last question. We talked about this a little bit before we actually started recording. Numerous reports coming out now of women dropping out of the workforce at a rate 4 times faster than men. Thoughts about the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic on women's careers in the arts field, and loss of jobs. Many of them are part of the gig economy.
I don't have data to be able to provide an evidence-based response, but I can simply provide my own personal opinion. And from what we see, we have conducted some research within the art museum field about gender equity in art museum directorships. And particularly at larger institutions, it's difficult for women to get to a CEO position. It's not that there aren't women on staff, but they tend to be more in middle management. So it's great in the sense that over time, women have made progress towards achieving more equity than they had in the past in terms of management of arts and cultural organizations. I am sad to say that I think that there will probably be somewhat of a regression of that. As you're pointing out, what's affecting most sectors of the economy right now is also affecting arts and cultural organizations, as women employees are having to take on more of the burden of elder care as well as child care, as well as homeschooling. The bigger question is, how will boards deal with the issue moving forward? What kind of institutional funders, as well as individual funders, will try to take the issue seriously enough to want to inspire that there be some kind of rectification of the situation for women as they're not only dealing with current circumstances, but coming back into a workforce. I read recently an article about within universities, how a tenure clock had been extended for female faculty members who were dealing with having to take on these additional responsibilities.
That's great. I had not heard that.
So it's how can we start thinking now about ways to support women so that they are able to be successful, that we're not setting them up for failure through lack of flexibility, through being penalized for not necessarily being able to be superwomen.
Yeah, the study that you're referring to, by the way, and I just want to say thank you, because it was one of the probably 3 or 4 pillars of inspiration on which Dance Data Project got started. It really just revolutionized my thinking and seeing what was possible. And then the fact that not only was the study done, but it was updated so that you could see where and how the progress had been made. I will note, which I thought was was really interesting that the study was done, the impetus came from within American, help me with your...
Association of Art Museum Directors, AAMD.
Yeah, yeah. So the Association of Art Museum Directors commissioned this, right?
Yeah, they did. They had conducted the survey already and came to us and said, can you help us with the analysis and writing up of the report? It was a rewarding project for us, and we were really happy that they undertook it. It would be great to see that kind of research undertaken in all fields, quite honestly. You know, through SMU DataArts, we have a workforce demographic study. It's a survey that looks at not only, it looks at all demographic characteristics of employees, board members, artists, volunteers. So looking at gender as well as looking at racial equity, looking at disability status, looking at age, and trying to understand what are the characteristics of a workforce and what's the extent to which they mirror or representative of the characteristics of the community. What we find frequently is that the percentage of women working in arts and cultural organizations is actually a bit higher than the population of women in a community, either at parity or a little bit higher. What we don't always see is that it's represented in all ranks of the organization.
Yeah, as I said, my cubicles and windows test. You know, where are the women sitting in the middle of the room? And I would love to get a copy of that workforce demographic study. Sure. There is so much out there that is fascinating that I'm sure eventually you and SMU DataArts will get to. What a resource. How exciting that you are available. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for everything you do. And thanks for being an inspiration for Dance Data Project.
Well, thank you, Liza. Thank you for the invitation. And my thanks to all in the dance field who are curious to learn more and who are out there doing the hard work of being relevant with meaningful work in their communities.